Hello, everyone, and welcome to the eighth edition of Finding Our Freedom. Finding Our Freedom is about the positive political and socioeconomic change that we need to see in the Caribbean and how to make it happen. We aim to transform how Caribbean people understand the challenges in this region and empower everyone with the actionable solutions to drive real change in our communities and our countries. Freedom comes from self sufficiency, so we will be exploring the ways in which we as Caribbean people can secure greater levels of freedom via strengthening our self sufficiency on an individual and collective level. Freedoms also require and depend on everyone taking responsibility. So we will explore the ways in which we as Caribbean people can live more responsibly and can hold our leaders to account for delivering on their responsibilities. On this episode of Finding Our Freedom, we explore the whole issue of self sufficiency in energy, which I think underpins our broader socioeconomic sovereignty. Just have a look at what's happening in Cuba, a country on its knees not for the first time, based on its dependence on other countries mainly for its energy needs. And while the rest of us in the Caribbean might want to regard Cuba as unique, and we might want to think that this could never happen to us, I actually disagree. Insofar as we are all import dependent for the majority of our energy needs, we could all find ourselves caught in the geopolitical crossfire, as Cuba has. In any event, securing our energy sovereignty would be a positive development for all of us, especially if it's greener. And here to discuss the issue of energy with me today is the CEO of Sol Ecolution, Mr. Dami Adesegha. Dami, welcome to Finding Our Freedom.
Thank you, Marla. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. But before we get into the questions that I have for you, and later on, we also have some journalists on the line who will have their questions for both of us. I just want to discuss and highlight this new energy index that we've created together, the Caribbean Energy Index, where we attempted to look at energy prices, electricity prices specifically, across the Caribbean and how we can address some of the high cost of electricity in the Caribbean. So let's bring up some of the slides where we have this index displayed, and we will discuss why we did this index and the methodology behind it. So we have the QR code there for all our viewers to be able to download the index, which is available online. And on the first slide, you will see that what we did was we looked at electricity prices across the Caribbean. When you download the index itself, it will go into a lot of detail as to what this methodology looks like and how we went about collecting the data and constructing the index. So I won't go into that right here in this discussion. But what we attempted to do here was compare all the electricity prices across the Caribbean and compare with the global average, which you will see in the darker blue horizontal line, and the Caribbean average, which is in the lighter blue line just above the global average. And this chart shows us very clearly some of the challenges we're facing because almost all of us have electricity prices that are higher than the global average. And what that means is it's harder for us to achieve competitiveness for our economies, and it's harder for us, therefore, to achieve progress. And Dami, I just want to thank you and Sol Ecolution for partnering with us in creating this index.
Absolutely. It was our pleasure to be a part of this, and I appreciate the collaboration that led to this index. And to your point, I think it does tell a story around the pricing of electricity here in the Caribbean relative to the rest of the world.
Yes, some of us have electricity prices that are 3 times the global average and almost twice the Caribbean average, which is, of course, unsustainable on many levels. On the next slide, though, what we attempted to do was to show the countries that have renewable energy adoption and renewable electricity production and mapping the countries with electricity price, of course, on the vertical axis, and the amount of renewable energy production as a percentage of total electricity production on the horizontal axis. And what you can see clearly here is that there is a relationship that shows the higher your renewable energy production share of total and electricity production, it tends to drive the cost of overall electricity production down, as you can see with Belize, Suriname, and so on the right-hand side of the chart. I don't know if you have any comments on that, Dami.
Yeah, no, I think you said it well, Marla. It does show the relationship clearly between increasing renewable energy adoption and ultimately a reduction in electricity costs on the ground to the people of the various countries. I think this is primarily due to, the pricing of renewable energy. When you think about solar, when you think about wind, these are fairly mature technologies that have reducing pricing as time has ultimately gone on. And we're now at a point where it is more economically cheaper, essentially, to as you get more renewables online, it brings down the cost of the overall electricity. And so I think that's really what this chart shows. Not only is there the benefit of having a more sustainable energy mix as you increase the renewable energy within the system, but it also has real economic impacts as far as the cost of energy to the people in the country.
Yeah, the cost of energy to the people in terms of their households, but also the cost of energy to doing business. So, for example, tourism is our largest sector in the Caribbean, and the Week on the Beach index that the IMF had done some years ago shows how uncompetitively priced our tourism product is, and part of that is because of the electricity cost. So, in any event, bringing down electricity costs for businesses as well means that they will be much more efficient, much more competitive, and therefore more successful, which will then make all our economies presumably more successful.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, energy is such a core part of any society and such a core part of really society, being productive and economies growing. And so being such a core kind of service that's so important to the development of economies, keeping the price of electricity and energy more generally as low as possible has makes a real difference in terms of society's ability to improve and to continue to grow. And so, as you said, not only to individuals, to households, but to businesses as well, it really does drive the flywheel that enables society to improve, economies to grow, and ultimately brings benefits to everyone involved. And so, really, a core part of the ecosystem.
Yep, indeed. And on the next slide, I just want to describe a little bit what we did here. Most people would be aware of the Big Mac Index. And what the Big Mac Index attempts to do, the Economist magazine basically looked at the price of Big Macs all over the world, wherever there were Big Macs. And they rank from the highest cost to the lowest cost, the cost of a Big Mac in all the countries across the world. And what this does is it shows you what is the purchasing power of a dollar in all of those countries. On the flip side to purchasing power, basically what it shows you is how expensive life is in those countries. So, for example, the highest cost Big Mac in the world is in Switzerland. It's $7, say, let's just say almost $8 US for a Big Mac in Switzerland. Whereas in India, you can get a Big Mac for half the price, less than half the price you could in Switzerland. And so, what that means is the cost of living and the cost structure in Switzerland is more than twice that of India. What we try to do here on this index is we don't want to just look at the cost of electricity. We want to look at how affordable is electricity in these jurisdictions in the Caribbean. And so what we did was we used a purchasing power index, and we combined that with our index for energy prices that you saw in the first chart. And we came up with this version of our index, which is basically showing us the purchasing power adjusted electricity price. And you would notice that what it's done is it's showed us which countries electricity is the most unaffordable or burdensome financially. Bermuda is still at the top. Turks and Caicos is still high up there. But Barbados moved from having, for example, an average nominal price of electricity all the way up to being the third most financially burdened cost of electricity in the Caribbean. Cayman is fourth, Anguilla, Bahamas, and so on. So this just helps us to understand how affordable or unaffordable electricity is in the Caribbean and how much of a burden it is on people, and therefore how much more of an incentive it is to adopt renewable energy in these countries where electricity is the most unaffordable.
Yeah, no, to your point, Marla, I think it tells a very clear story around the pricing of electricity as you look across the various markets here in the Caribbean. And it is really quite a wide range when you look at the variability of it. Again, when you think about Bermuda all the way to the left and then Suriname all the way to the right. And ultimately, I think supports the story around increasing renewables really making a difference in terms of the day-to-day experience that people have on the ground in these markets. There's a real opportunity as renewables becomes a larger part of the ecosystem to not only drive the sustainability improvements, but also to drive improvements in terms of the cost of living, the quality of life, so on and so forth, in these markets as the overall cost of electricity goes lower and lower. And so, really, I look at this chart and what I see is continued opportunity, right? Where currently today we have a certain level of penetration of renewable energy within these markets. And there's certainly the appetite, I think, across the Caribbean to continue to increase the percentage of renewable energy that comprises the energy ecosystem. And really, this tells a story of the opportunity for, as we increase and add more renewable energy, whether it's solar or wind or EVs or hydrogen, the gamut of technologies that are available, as we add those more and more to the ecosystem, it ultimately will have a myriad of benefits to the people and to the markets. And so I think this tells the overall story of the pricing, but also points to the opportunity that's in front of us as far as the real difference that can be made as renewables becomes a larger part of the ecosystem.
For sure. And so, on that point, share with me your thoughts on a country that you think got it right, that went ahead with renewable energy adoption. What was it? Tell us their story. What did they do, and how did they manage to get it right?
Sure. So one of the themes that I'll touch on is, ultimately for renewable energy adoption to, be successful within any given market. And, as Sol Ecolution, we have a landscape really across 23 markets within the Caribbean. And so I get to see this across many different markets and
Right.
ultimately collate those experiences to give you some of the perspectives that I'll bring today. So,
Yeah.
thinking across the Caribbean, I think there are really a couple of components that matter when you want to increase renewable energy adoption. And it really comes down to collaboration and communication, I think, between the key stakeholders that enable this, being investors such as, myself and Sol Ecolution, the governments, who bring kind of government support, the utility, who oftentimes, especially in some of these smaller islands, is the off-taker for the energy that ultimately gets produced, and they manage the transmission system and so forth. And then the regulator being the fourth stakeholder who ultimately creates the guidelines by which people must adhere to in
Yeah.
order to kind of build these projects. I think a good example of where this has come together nicely to your question is perhaps in Jamaica. If
Hmm.
you look over the last 10 to 15 years in Jamaica, they've really adopted quite a bit of solar at the utility scale and also some wind at the utility scale as well that has made a real improvement in terms of the percentage of renewable energy relative to the overall energy demand of the country. And there, if you look at it, there's been really good and close collaboration between, again, the utility, JPS, the government showing government supports in many different ways, and the regulator that has put together a comprehensive set of guidelines that are very clear and understandable and predictable, through which people can create these projects. And that ultimately creates an environment that drives investor interest and brings the labor and the capital and the other things that you need to ultimately build the projects. And so what that's looked like over the last, again, 12 years is really three procurement processes that have led to three, I think, meaningful projects within Jamaica.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Two on the solar side and one on the wind side, which again have increased the renewable energy percentage in Jamaica by probably 20 to 30% when you look at the numbers. And so
Wow.
that's
20
a
to
good example.
30% reduction in electricity costs. That's significant. Sorry to interrupt you, but I just had to, reinforce that. That's
Yeah, yeah.
fantastic.
Well, to be clear, 20 to 30% more renewable energy as a part of the mix,
Ah, okay, okay, okay.
not specifically the cost,
Okay.
but as we can see on the chart, Jamaica does fall below the average and is closer
Yes.
to the bottom than to the top. And so I do think
Yes.
that has had an impact on the overall electricity cost here in Jamaica. Now, unfortunately, with Hurricane Melissa late last year, that has had an impact on Jamaica that they're building back from, which may have kind of short-term impacts as they get back to ultimately normal. But looking at it on a longer-term perspective, and again, going to your question of a market that has done a good job in terms of encouraging more renewable energy, I think that's one that we can point to and other markets can look at as far as the recipe that they've used and ultimately what works.
So in Jamaica, thanks for highlighting how they went about doing this. And you said they had all of this collaboration with the government, the regulator, and the electricity producer. Um, did that mean that the government and the regulator had to, for example, amend legislation, revise the regulatory framework? Are those the kinds of reforms that were needed in Jamaica to facilitate this kind of renewable energy penetration happening?
Yeah. No, good question. So I think really what it looked like there was they effectively ran a set of procurement processes,
Okay.
or requests for proposals from players within the market, or sorry, players within the industry,
Mm-hmm.
to say, hey, we want to ultimately build out a utility scale solar farm, to use an example, and then
Mm-hmm.
they would put out a set of guidelines. Here are the technical specifications that the solar farm needs to hit. Here is the process through which we will assess kind of which of the submissions are ultimately successful. And, they put out a comprehensive set of guidelines that ultimately the regulator contributes to in terms of, what that process looks like and how it fits into the regulatory system within Jamaica. It takes
Right.
government support in order to ultimately push that through from a legislative perspective and
Right.
thinking about all the societal impacts that it ultimately has. JPS as the utility is the ultimate off-taker for the energy that's produced from these systems, and so is an integral part of the system there and the process working out. And then investors also coming in with an interest to invest the capital required and provide the labor and the expertise to ultimately build out these solar farms. And so it's really that kind of collaboration and communication that comes together. And at the end of the day, these are fairly complex projects that again
Mm-hmm.
really satisfy a core need of these societies. And so, while generally speaking, there's lots of supports for increased renewables within the ecosystem. It really takes more than just positive intent. I think the understand each stakeholder really understanding the context and realities that the other stakeholders operate in. I think and that kind of coming together to ultimately build a process that addresses the various contexts and realities of all the stakeholders is where
Mm-hmm.
it really comes together nicely and leads to the construction and ultimate successful operations of these projects. And where that understanding and shared kind of context doesn't exist, it generally leads to processes that are less comprehensive and could sometimes have unintended consequences that don't support the continued adoption. So, again, I think Jamaica is one example of where they've gotten it right. And
Yeah.
again, if you look back over the last 10 years, they've been able to have these projects get built and ultimately increase the renewable energy percentage within the country.
And Jamaica's been, I mean, from my perspective, and I say this all the time, in the English speaking Caribbean in particular, but not limited to English speaking, to me, across the Caribbean, Jamaica is that country in the last 15 years that has made the most socioeconomic progress. And they measure their progress. For example, they're the only country that's measuring poverty on a regular basis. I think their last measure was somewhere around 2024. Nobody is measured anywhere else in the Caribbean apart from Dominican Republic poverty that recently demonstrating how their people have been made better off over the past several years. And I just stick that in there because at the end of the day, Dami, this only matters if it makes people's lives better. If reducing energy prices and renewable energy adoption didn't make people's lives better, then why would we even bother? But the fact is, it does, and it drives costs down, and that's the biggest factor that I think is important to making people's lives better. But there must be other positive aspects as well. Could you highlight for us what are some of the other positive spin-offs from
Sure.
renewable energy adoption, apart from the obvious reduction in cost, which this, our indices demonstrate clearly?
Sure. No, absolutely. I think one of the other benefits that oftentimes gets missed is, really as it relates to foreign exchange and
Mm-hmm.
US dollars within many of these economies. Importing ultimately is done on a US dollar basis. And, in many of these countries that have local currencies and those local currencies relationship with the US dollar kind of fluctuates over time. It can make it a bit more difficult when you're, thinking about the budget of a country when the pricing of energy fluctuates over time. And so one of the other benefits is ultimately as you get renewable energy in, it stabilizes that cost for you and gives you a very predictable cost over the course of 10, 15, 20 years.
Yep.
Oftentimes these contracts are multi-decade contracts, and so you get visibility long term into the future of what that cost looks like, and it stops being kind of a fluctuating number. But then also, oftentimes you can, depending on the way the deals are structured, there's a local currency component and a US dollar component, and it can actually help to stem the outflow of US dollars and help to compensate for some of that using local currency. So that's, a benefit that oftentimes gets missed, but is also, a real benefit as you kind of increase the renewable energy penetration within a given market. And look, we're highlighting Jamaica here, but as I noted, we get to see this across a broad swath of the Caribbean. And ultimately, it's not a one size fits all in terms of what works for every country. Smaller islands have different needs than some of the larger islands. If you think about the variability of the country size, population size, so on and so forth across the Caribbean. But I would say the overall theme and the overall headline is, you know, beyond just the sustainability and the cost implications as you increase the renewable energy within the ecosystem, it does also help from a budgeting and a foreign exchange perspective as well.
Now, last week, I did my Caribbean Economic Outlook, which is available on my website and on my YouTube channel. And the one thing that I chose to highlight as a theme across the Caribbean is the fact that in almost every country in the Caribbean, all of our foreign exchange reserves is borrowed because our foreign debt denominated in foreign currency is higher than the level of reserves that we hold at the central bank. And that means we have to pay back this debt plus interest with reserves that are less than the debt that we hold in US dollars. And so, to your point, Dami, this renewable energy adoption is going to help us to save on foreign exchange expenditure for energy. And this is an issue that is critical to the Caribbean right now because almost all of us have reserves that are more than 100% borrowed. That means we have some serious external weakness. What do I mean by that? Weakness in respect to our reserves, weakness in respect to the strength of our currencies. And that's a major vulnerability across the entire Caribbean. And so I just want to highlight your point that renewable energy adoption does not just drive down the cost of the electricity, it also helps us to save on the foreign exchange that is so precious and becoming increasingly scarce in the Caribbean.
Hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. I think I couldn't have said it better myself. I do think it has a myriad of benefits.
Yes, but tell us, I mean, I'm sure there are other organizations that support countries in looking to increase their renewable energy penetration, apart from Sol Ecolution, who actually would come and implement, a solar system. In terms of financing, technical expertise, can you share with us some information on those organizations?
Sure, absolutely. So, to your point, maybe I'll start with financing, where you can see the traditional suite of organizations that can provide that both from a grant funding perspective, but also providing advantaged financing, whether it's debt or other types of financing. And so you could think about your traditional development organizations who have mandates and who have missions to ultimately provide financing and use that as a way to facilitate more of these projects within the region. And so I think engagement with those types of organizations is certainly helpful from a
Yes.
financing perspective. And then you can also think about there are many nonprofits out there that provide expertise, whether it's technical or otherwise, as far as how to ultimately structure some of these projects as you
Mm-hmm.
try to get more and more of them online. There are a suite of organizations that can support this type of thing where a market needs to increase its renewable energy penetration. But again, I think I would go back to I think the most important thing is really the collaboration between the key stakeholders, being the governments, the utility, the regulator, and then ultimately investors as well, and understanding the shared context between those stakeholders so that the ultimate systems that you build or the processes that you kind of build are practical and actually address kind of the key needs of all those stakeholders so that you get to a successful outcome.
The development banks in the Caribbean are definitely development partners that we are grateful to have, such as I mean, just to highlight them again, the Inter-American Development Bank, the IDB, the Latin American Development Bank, CAF, the Caribbean Development Bank, the CDB, and we also have the CARICOM Development Bank. Those are the main ones operating in the Caribbean, and all of them are supportive of renewable energy transition. Just before we switch to inviting our journalists to ask their questions, one thing I wanted to highlight, you know, we we like to say things like, we want to be net zero, we want to basically support renewable energy because it is greener, because it's more sustainable, and it brings down our carbon emissions. The thing about the Caribbean and small island developing states is that even if we were all net zero, and by the way, some of us are net zero, Guyana and Suriname are examples of that. The thing is, we are less than 2% of global carbon emissions, right? And so this is not necessarily going to move the needle in terms of carbon emissions and the effect that it has on climate change. But what I wanted to highlight was that we recently had last year the ICJ opinion on the obligations of states as it relates to the planet. And we've also seen recently the so-called Bonaire ruling in a court in the Netherlands, which is basically saying that the Netherlands needs to, and we have a lot of overseas territories and colonies in the Caribbean. As a matter of fact, we have more colonies in the Caribbean than we have sovereign countries, and a lot of people don't realize that. And what this ruling in the Netherlands found was that insofar as the Netherlands has spent money on protecting its people and its property from the effects of the climate crisis, they need to spend the same amount in an equitable basis. They need to demonstrate equitable assistance to their colonies in the Caribbean. So you have Curacao, Aruba, Bonaire, Saba, St. Eustatius, St. Martin, for example. They need to demonstrate that they're equitable in their support in the Caribbean for their colonies in addressing the effects of the climate crisis. And I find this very interesting because it means you have British overseas territories, US territories, French territories, and Dutch territories in the Caribbean who are going to have to take a closer look at how in Europe these countries are protecting their own, and they need to therefore do the same for the Caribbean jurisdictions that are within their purview and their overseas jurisdictions. And I find that very interesting because it means we are likely to see an increase in demand for renewable energy transition and for other mechanisms to protect us from the effects of the climate crisis going forward. I'm not sure if you saw that ruling in the Netherlands.
I think every bit helps, and particularly being on the receiving end of more natural disasters, hurricanes, things like that.
Exactly.
And I definitely think the efforts are not wasted to transition the Caribbean towards more sustainable energy.
Exactly. We have to do our part as well. So, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to invite the journalists who are present here with us to join us and to share the questions that they might have regarding what we've just discussed, everything we've just discussed, and regarding the index that we've created. So I see we have Ryan Bechu, who is from Trinidad and Tobago. He's going to type in some of his questions. That's no problem, as his microphone is having a bit of an issue. No problem, Ryan. You can put them here in the chat. But if there are any others who want to chime in with their questions, we're happy to receive those questions. Jean-Michel, welcome.
Hi, Marla. Hi, Dami. Yeah, it was a great presentation. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us, and welcome, James.
Hi, guys. Can you hear me?
Yes, we're hearing you.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks for a good presentation. Dami, so it's interesting. You mentioned JPS in Jamaica. I've just Googled them, and I think you've got the shareholders, is the government, and then two corporations. I think Marubeni is one. So perhaps it depends on, like you say, it's about stakeholders, right? So if the government of Jamaica is a stakeholder in JPS and a shareholder in JPS, then it's part of the national interest for renewable adoption. If in Cayman we have a utility that is privately owned, then maybe you've got less of an incentive for that adoption of renewable energy. Because
if I might jump in there to answer that,
Marla.
James. I mean, when you look at Barbados, for example, the power generator there is a privately owned, and yet still we've seen a lot of solar adoption in Barbados. So I think Dami's point is it almost doesn't really matter too much about the ownership structure and the even monopoly structure of the power generator. It's really all the stakeholders coming together, and if the government decides, listen, we want a system where people can generate their own electricity via solar on their rooftops, for example, then we have to address and change and reform the legislative framework and the regulatory framework to make that happen. And I feel like what it really requires, as to Dami's point, is it requires all the stakeholders coming together and coming to an agreement that makes sense and making the necessary changes to the system to make that a reality. Let me just move quickly because we don't have a whole lot. Thanks for your question, James. Ryan Vechu has asked, do you see countries such as Trinidad and Tobago and Suriname making any real effort towards renewables, given that they are oil and gas economies? And that's a very interesting question. In Suriname and in Guyana, they already have renewable energy generation in terms of a lot of hydro, in particular hydro energy, and Trinidad and Tobago also has been increasing its solar energy penetration, maybe not to the extent that we would like them to, but they have made a start. And so my answer to that question is absolutely yes. I see them making an effort, even though they are oil and gas exporters. And Ryan's follow-up question is, what does Trinidad and Tobago need to do to go where Jamaica has gone? And I think that's a very important question. Insofar as electricity is subsidized, right? Which is the case in Trinidad and Tobago. I just came from Bahamas, where the government of Bahamas is looking to buy the Emera power generator, and with a view to bringing down the cost of electricity, which suggests to me that they might want to be subsidizing the cost of electricity. What that does, of course, it makes the cost of electricity cheaper to the user, both household as well as business. And that has given Trinidad and Tobago a competitive advantage. But what it means is that this subsidy drives on the cost of electricity and then makes renewable energy that much less price competitive, right? And artificially so, because then, you are competing with a much lower cost per kilowatt hour of electricity. And the second thing that subsidy does, in my view, is that it causes an overconsumption of electricity because it's cheaper, and you don't want to encourage overconsumption of a finite resource that is, of course, fossil fuel based, as we have in Trinidad and Tobago right now. And then thirdly, that is actually a cost to the taxpayer. We are subsidizing something that we're in the end paying for in another way, and that's just not the way. It causes all kinds of distortion. That's not the best way to do that. And so, to answer the question that Ryan is asking, what does Trinidad and Tobago need to do to go where Jamaica has done? I think Trinidad and Tobago needs to phase out its subsidy on electricity. And that's my perspective. Dami, I don't know if you have a perspective to share on Trinidad and Tobago specifically.
Yeah, no, I mean, on Trinidad specifically, you probably know more than I do, Marla, about their specific kind of dynamics. But what I would say, generally speaking, around the path that has been set in Jamaica, there's actually lots of kind of publicly available information about what Jamaica has done as far as the processes that they've run to ultimately get these large renewable energy projects built. And I would say any market that wants to follow that example, there's lots that you can point to that, again, is publicly available to understand how they structured it, what the contracts look like, how they ran the processes, so on and so forth. And so I would encourage any market that wants to do that to kind of seek out some of that information and, contact people, things like that, and then follow the example that they've ultimately set.
Agreed. And so to the last question from Ryan, how do you analyze the new government's decision not to raise electricity prices? I really don't want to comment because politics trumps economics, and I don't understand. I have to admit, many times I do not understand the decisions that politicians make. So I cannot comment on a decision that I really don't understand. If they tell us exactly what is the analysis that they did to arrive at this conclusion that it's not best right now to raise the electricity prices, then I can analyze that evidence that they present. Insofar as it's not an evidence-based policy decision, I really can't comment. I really can't. I apologize. I think that there are negative consequences of that decision, but there are also positive consequences. It'll keep inflation down. It'll keep the cost of living down. It'll keep the cost of doing business down. But to what effect? And to what benefit and to what detriment and to whom, and there will be some of that as well. So that's how I would comment on that. We have Jean-Michel here. Thank you, Jean-Michel, for waiting so patiently. This is a good friend of mine, Jean-Michel, all the way from Martinique. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Yes, it was very insightful. I'm afraid there was some time when I was not able to hear everything going on for some, but now I can hear everybody perfectly again. So
Great.
I hope
So
my
we're happy
question
to
is
have your questions.
yeah. So I hope my questions aren't going to make you repeat what you have already said. But with these charts that I looked at, these are questions that I prepared before
Mhm.
the presentation.
Mhm.
With these charts, well, did you get any like seemingly counterintuitive insights? For example, in Dominica, I saw that the cost of energy shown on chart one was fairly high, despite Dominica having a lot of geothermal potential, which I think they are not tapping to its
Not
full
yet.
extent yet.
Yeah.
And yeah, which brings the second question, which would be like when so in a few years from now, Dominica will have that geothermal energy harnessed. We hope, uh, at least they say. So that means that things will change drastically. So with different countries in the situations that are evolving, do you expect that you will be able to update this index, even though I'm sure it was a very a huge effort to compile all this data?
We do intend to update the index. I think we decided, Dami, forgive me if I'm incorrect. Correct me if I'm wrong. I thought we agreed maybe every 6 months, simply because this kind of data is not updated very frequently. Um, so we do intend to update it, and of course, when the energy mix changes in various countries, not just Dominica, yes, we will reflect that in the data in the charts.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
And so I'm I really hope that it's not going to be something that you have said already, but there were like a few minutes where I really had a hard time hearing. I
No
could see but not hear.
problem.
So yeah, yeah, I mean with like the Caribbean countries, we have like those sovereign nations, non-sovereign. We have like very different geographical entities in terms of mountains, no flat and everything. So of
Mhm.
course, and oil and gas extraction somewhere in some countries. So of course, we're going to have extremely like wildly different prices, just based on that. But with now that we have this comparison tool, um, what outcomes are you going to do you expect now that I mean, for me from Martinique, I was very happy to see that Martinique was in this and the index and stuff, and of course and I was surprised to see that it's not that energy is not that expensive in Martinique compared to some neighboring countries. uh, but then I'm not going to be like, oh, I want the energy to be as cheap as in Suriname or Trinidad and Tobago, considering how different the situation is. So what are the outcomes that you are aiming for?
I mean, I would like to see, in from my perspective, greater energy sovereignty, right? And in insofar as most countries are importing their oil and gas needs, the fact that we have so much sunlight, so much wind, and in some countries geothermal potential, insofar as we can build greater energy sovereignty, it makes us more independent, and it makes us therefore more free and less subject to international forces as it relates to the price of electricity and energy, as it relates to geopolitical like challenges like what Cuba is experiencing, as I mentioned earlier.
Hopefully, as we update this, index, every 6 months and see the trends over time, hopefully we ultimately see that line come down in terms of the overall cost of the energy within the countries here in the Caribbean. And, we've talked about all the benefits that ultimately will lead to for, all aspects of society within these markets. So I'd say on an overall basis, getting the word out there and increasing visibility and, education around it, hopefully that kind of leads to positive improvements in terms of renewable energy and the ultimate price. And again, leads to the benefits that we've talked about within these societies.
Including saving foreign exchange if we have to import less oil and gas and we now generate more renewable energy domestically. And that's an important factor for many countries in the Caribbean. I see Ryan has put one more question here, which is quite interesting. How do you see the developments in Venezuela helping or hurting the region's energy security? Now, that's an important question because, again, I want to go back to the whole geopolitical issue and how geopolitics and geoeconomics affects us in the Caribbean and from an energy perspective and otherwise. Having more renewable energy generation domestically helps to insulate us from the vagaries of geopolitics and geoeconomics. And so I would like to see us have more energy sovereignty by having more renewable energy adoption. Specifically, Venezuela, insofar as what has happened in Venezuela, and we're already, I highlighted this in my recent Caribbean Economic Overview, which is available on my website and on my YouTube channel. Insofar as we've already seen a resurgence of economic activity in Venezuela, we've seen the stock market basically pick up in Caracas. We've seen asset prices improve. We've seen a renewed interest in foreign direct investment in Venezuela. I think a greater level of socioeconomic stability and political stability in Venezuela will be positive for neighboring Guyana, neighboring Trinidad and Tobago, and could potentially, if Trinidad and Tobago is able to capitalize on the gas in the fields that straddle Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago's marine space, I think it can be positive for the region's energy security. And I want to thank Ryan for that question. Dami, you can jump in if you have a perspective on that.
I don't have a detailed perspective on it. Tough to say how things will ultimately unfold in Venezuela, or
yes.
So I might stay away from that one. But not much.
No problem
for me.
No problem. Well, unfortunately, we've come up on the time that we have to end now. I feel like we can stay and talk about this for another few hours, but unfortunately, we're out of time. I just want to thank, first of all, the journalists who stayed on as long as you have and have asked us important questions around the index and around renewable energy adoption more broadly in the Caribbean. Thank you very much to Jean-Michel, James, and Ryan for participating and sending us your questions. And of course, to you, Dami, I can't overstate how grateful I am for your partnership in creating this Caribbean Energy Price Index in conjunction with me and my team. Dami, the CEO of Sol Ecolution, thank you very much for your participation as well on this call. And I look forward to many more types of discussions. I look forward to greater partnership with you and your team as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Marla. I appreciate the collaboration. Thanks for having me, and thanks to the journalists as well. It's been a great conversation, and I look forward to many more in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.